What if the name that humanity worships above all, the name whispered in fear and awe across a million worlds, was not what anyone believed? What if the Emperor of mankind, the unchallenged master of Terra, the architect of the Imperium, the being whose very essence has shaped the fate of humanity, had a name so ancient, so forbidden, that even knowing it could unravel the fragile illusions that hold the galaxy together? For 10,000 years, billions have knelt before his throne, calling him the Emperor. But the truth of his origin has been buried beneath layers of myth, history, and secrecy that even the most zealous of imperial scholars dare not fully uncover. His true name is not recorded in any standard chronicle, nor inscribed in the sacred tomes of the Adeptus Terra, for the knowledge of it has been carefully guarded by those who remember the days before history began. Long before the Imperium spanned 1,000 worlds, long before the age of strife sundered human civilization into fragments, there existed a figure who would become the Emperor, not as a ruler, not as a god, but as a man of unfathomable intellect and ambition. Ancient records speak of a being known by many names, scattered across the dying colonies of old Earth, Atlantis, and lands lost to time. Some call him Neoth, others whisper of a scholar or a warlord whose vision pierced the chaos of the galaxy and saw the path humanity could take. In the earliest surviving fragments of human history, there are hints of a figure who walked the line between legend and reality, a person who could manipulate both flesh and spirit, science and sorcery, with a mastery that mortals could scarcely comprehend. These identities, these echoes of a being who may have been the Emperor himself, pose one of the greatest enigmas of the 41st millennium. If we knew his original name, would we recognize him as a hero, a tyrant, or something far stranger? It is said that names hold power, even in the grim darkness of the far future. To know a true name is to command it, to touch the essence of a being in a way that transcends mere words. And yet, the Emperor's true name has been stripped from the memory of humanity. The ancient custodians of knowledge, the silent lords who orchestrated the rise of the Imperium, chose to erase it, fearing the ramifications of such understanding. Some speculate that revealing it could shatter the faith of billions, or worse, draw the attention of entities lurking in the warp, eager to consume the essence of the being who has held chaos at bay for millennia. There are whispers among the astropathic archives that the Emperor, in his own inscrutable wisdom, allowed this erasure, crafting an identity for himself that could endure across the countless centuries of war and suffering. But what was his true name before the galactic stage was set, and before humanity called him their savior? The first clues lie not in the stars, nor in the records of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but in the shadowed annals of pre-imperial history. Archaeologists of the far future, those brave or foolhardy enough to dig through the detritus of the dark age of technology, have uncovered fragments of manuscripts, crystalline tablets, and trans-temporal recordings that speak of a figure of immense charisma and intellect, a being who appeared simultaneously in distant sectors, shaping human societies, guiding development, and protecting nascent civilizations from horrors that could not yet be named. Some fragments describe Neoth as a philosopher-warrior, others as a ruler whose reign was marked by both mercy and inexorable cruelty. The accounts are contradictory, yet they share a common thread, a presence that seems both immortal and deeply human, a mind capable of bending the future to its will without ever revealing its ultimate purpose. Could this Neoth, whose name appears once in the fragments of long-lost worlds, be the man who would eventually become the Emperor? Even more unsettling are the tales recorded by the Adeptus Custodes, whispered in the corridors of the Imperial Palace where sunlight never reaches. These guardians speak not of titles or accolades, but of the Emperor's actions during the Great Crusade, where his strategy transcended comprehension, where he knew the desires and weaknesses of mortals and Xenos alike before they themselves were aware of them. They call him the Master of Mankind, but the stories hint at something deeper, a shadow of a memory that predates Terra, predates the first battles against the alien races of the galaxy. Those who have studied the forbidden sections of the Imperial archives speak of a resonance, a name that vibrates in the mind of those who hear it, carrying the weight of millennia and the agony of countless choices made in the pursuit of humanity's survival. This is not merely history, it is a record of the very essence of the being whose life is entwined with the fate of stars. Across the Imperium, myths intertwine with reality. Some scholars suggest the Emperor was born as a mortal, the culmination of humanity's psychic potential, a being forged by the collective hopes and fears of a dying species. Others claim he has always existed, a timeless entity who guided humanity through the darkness of the age of strife, whose true name is less a personal identifier and more a code of power that could awaken dormant psychic forces or even unravel the fabric of reality itself. There are whispers in the forbidden corners of the Inquisition that the Emperor's name might have been uttered once in secret rituals during the Great Crusade, only to be deliberately erased when the consequences became clear. Some say the knowledge is encoded in the minds of the Primarchs, scattered across the stars, but lost when the forces of chaos twisted the sons of the Emperor into instruments of their own designs. To search for the Emperor's true name is to venture into a labyrinth where history, myth, and prophecy are inseparable. Every clue is shadowed by deliberate misdirection, every record carefully guarded, and every discovery potentially fatal. The scholars who dare seek it are forced to navigate the veiled politics of the Adeptus Terra, the silent manipulation of the Mechanicus, and the ever-present threat of the warp, which hungers for knowledge that mortal minds were never meant to hold. There are even tales that the Emperor himself allowed his name to be forgotten, understanding that its revelation would test the very limits of human comprehension, for a name is not just a word, it is a key to identity, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And yet, there are fragments, almost imperceptible, scattered across time and space, that seem to hint at the truth. A mention in a forgotten star map, a reference in a Xenos codex, the name Neoth appearing like a ghostly signature across unconnected worlds. Could these be echoes of his true self, glimpses of the identity that existed before the throne of Terra, before the eternal golden throne, before the galaxy kneeling in reverence and terror? Each fragment feels like a whisper from the past, a voice that asks, in silence, "Do you know who I was?" The answers remain tantalizingly out of reach, yet the possibility that humanity has worshipped an identity that is not quite real, that the Emperor we know is a mask, raises questions too profound to ignore. The mystery deepens when we consider the Emperor's interactions with the Primarchs. Each of these suns, cast across the galaxy, bore a fragment of his essence, and in them, one can detect traces of identities long forgotten. Some historians speculate that the Emperor experimented with aspects of his own being, shaping his sons as reflections of facets of Neoth, or even other, earlier selves whose names are lost to time. These shadows, mirrored in the blood and souls of the Primarchs, suggest a deliberate layering of identity, a stratagem to survive the cosmic forces that would seek to unmake him. And as we study the legends of the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and the near-divine presence of the Emperor in the aftermath, it becomes clear that the name we call him is merely a convenience, a placeholder for something that transcends mortal comprehension. Even in the darkness of the warp, where the Chaos Gods spy and manipulate the fate of humanity, there are hints that they know the Emperor by another name. Some whisper that the power he wields, the ability to restrain the tides of chaos, is tied intrinsically to this lost identity. To utter it, even mentally, is to summon consequences beyond imagining, to awaken forces that might tear the galaxy apart or bend it to an unknowable will. And yet, the tantalizing fragments persist, appearing in dreams, visions, and apocryphal texts, as though the truth is dangling just beyond human reach, daring the bold and the foolish to look deeper. But perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: the Emperor's true name may have been sacrificed, not to hide it from mankind, but to protect mankind from itself. In a galaxy where humanity is fragile, where superstition and fear have grown. Beneath the shattered spires of Terra's hive cities, where sunlight never penetrates and the air hums with the endless pulse of industry, a lone scholar moved through corridors forgotten by time. His robes were singed by the machinery of ancient manufactorums, his eyes sharp with the hunger of forbidden knowledge. In the silent archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, he uncovered fragments of text so old that the ink seemed to breathe with a life of its own. These manuscripts hinted at identities predating the Emperor, names spoken in whispers, buried under layers of ritualized erasure. Among the brittle pages, one name surfaced repeatedly: Neoth, a figure described as a master of both flesh and spirit, whose presence had subtly shaped human civilization long before the Imperium itself was conceived. The scholar traced the passages carefully, aware that each revelation carried a weight heavier than any weapon, and a single misstep might attract the attention of forces lurking beyond mortal comprehension. In the void beyond Terra, a strike cruiser drifted silently among the debris of 1,000 shattered worlds. Aboard, a company of space marines of the Ultramarines chapter meditated in the gloom, their armor reflecting the starlight that filtered through portholes like distant memories. Among them, one veteran, Sergeant Corvan, felt a peculiar unease, as though the cosmos itself whispered in a language older than reason. His thoughts turned to the Emperor, to the fragments of history that described a being who had walked the galaxy long before humanity's first recorded war. He pondered the sacrifices of his brothers, the endless battles fought in the Emperor's name, and the invisible threads of destiny that had placed him here, in a galaxy that refused to remember its own past. The weight of duty pressed on him as heavily as his ceramite armor, yet beneath it simmered a curiosity, a need to understand the truth of the figure they all served so blindly. On a distant, storm-lashed world at the fringe of the Segmentum Obscurus, ruins of a civilization older than recorded history emerged from the rocky plains. The scholar had deciphered coordinates hidden in Neoth's fragments, leading him to a citadel of blackened stone, adorned with glyphs that seemed to shift under the gaze. Lightning cracked across the sky as he descended into the chambers, each step echoing with the memory of countless lives lost to time and war. Within, he found inscriptions that defied comprehension, texts that spoke of a being who commanded the currents of both science and sorcery, who could shape minds and civilizations as one shapes clay. Symbols hinted at an experiment in identity itself, a deliberate layering of personalities, memories, and ambitions into a single nearly divine consciousness. It was a chilling revelation. The Emperor, perhaps, had never been merely one man, but the culmination of countless selves, each sacrificed, each hidden, to forge the ultimate protector of humanity. Yet even as the scholar pieced together the fragments of the past, the galaxy quaked with new threats. Warp storms of unprecedented scale erupted across the Segmentum Solar, tearing at the fabric of reality. The Astronomicon flickered, a weak pulse against the dark tide, and psychers screamed as the whispers of chaos grew louder. In the eye of these storms, the Emperor's silent vigil was tested, as if some force sought to measure the limits of his endurance. From the shadows emerged renegade sorcerers and cults devoted to names long forgotten, each claiming to know the true essence of the being humanity called the Emperor. Their attacks were not merely physical, they were assaults on memory, identity, and faith, designed to unearth secrets that had been buried for 10,000 years. Soldiers and citizens alike fell into despair, for the horrors they faced were not just of blade and fire, but of truth too terrible to contemplate. Amid the chaos, whispers of Neoth began to stir once more. Hidden archives spoke of interactions between the ancient figure and Xenos races, interactions erased from conventional records. The scholar learned of missions where humans and aliens had united under a shared vision, shaping technology and knowledge that would later underpin the Imperium. These alliances, fleeting and fragile, were erased from memory, as though the Emperor himself had willed them into oblivion. Every recovered fragment suggested a deliberate manipulation of history, a choreography spanning millennia, designed to mold humanity into a force capable of surviving the horrors to come. Yet the question remained, why such secrecy? Why was the true identity of this architect of mankind a forbidden truth, guarded even from those who serve him most faithfully? The answer seemed to lie in the very nature of power, and in the costs exacted by the preservation of civilization itself. In the depths of the warp, a consciousness stirred, aware of the scholar's pursuit and the whispers echoing among the stars. Demons watched, their forms flickering like smoke in the corners of perception, drawn by the scent of forbidden knowledge. Even the chaos gods, eternal predators of mortal ambition, sensed a fissure in the narrative of existence, a fragment of truth that might unravel the meticulous designs of the Emperor. They whispered in dreams, sowing doubt and curiosity, as though daring mortals to reach beyond their understanding. And yet, the Emperor remained unmoved, a figure of unimaginable power whose essence radiated from the Golden Throne, unseen but all-pervasive, restraining not only the forces of chaos, but the very consequences of revelation. In this theater of stars and shadows, the line between salvation and catastrophe grew perilously thin. Sergeant Corvan's mission led him to a forgotten battlefield on a moon, scarred by the fire of Xenos weapons. He walked among the rusted ruins of tanks, the shattered banners of lost regiments, and the charred corpses of foes and allies alike. In the silence, he felt the weight of 10,000 years pressing down on him, the choices of the Emperor echoing through time. He understood, in a visceral way, that the Emperor's identity, masked and obscured, was more than a secret. It was a burden borne so that humanity might endure. Each life sacrificed, each world conquered or saved, was part of a pattern that only the Emperor could perceive in its entirety. Yet a single question haunted him. If the true name of the Emperor were known, if the full story of Neoth and his ancient selves were revealed, would humanity still stand united, or crumble beneath the weight of knowledge it was never meant to bear? Back on Terra, the scholar deciphered an encrypted codex that spoke of a ritual performed by the Emperor in the early years of the Great Crusade. It described a convergence of psychic energies, an alignment of temporal and spatial vectors designed to obscure the true name from all who would seek it. The codex hinted at the use of the Primarchs as conduits, vessels through which fragments of the Emperor's original identity could be projected without revealing the whole. It was a revelation both brilliant and terrifying. The Emperor's concealment of his true self was not a mere act of caution, but a deliberate strategy to safeguard both his power and the survival of mankind. The implications were staggering. Every battle, every alliance, every betrayal might have been influenced by a calculation beyond mortal understanding. Each thread of history pulled to preserve the balance between order and chaos. In the void above the Segmentum Obscurus, a lone battleship faced an unexpected enemy, a demon host drawn through a weakening of the warp near Terra. The Space Marines engaged, their bolters roaring and chainswords tearing through the spectral forms. Yet every victory felt hollow. Corvan realized the fight was not just against the demonic, but against the erosion of truth itself, against forces seeking to manipulate memory and history to break the Imperium from within. Amid the carnage, visions of the Emperor flashed through his mind, faces, names, places that seemed familiar yet impossible. And in the distance, like a beacon in the dark, a fragment of Neoth's essence seemed to call, a reminder that the story of humanity was intertwined with a being whose depth no mortal could plumb. The war was not merely physical, it was existential. On the surface of a dying planet, the scholar discovered a chamber beneath the ruins, its walls etched with a script that seemed alive, pulsing faintly in response to his presence. The inscription spoke of consciousness layered upon consciousness, of identities folded into one another, and of a name that must remain unspoken to prevent catastrophe. Here, at the edge of human understanding, the scholar realized that the Emperor's true name was more than a label. It was a key to the very structure of reality, a word whose revelation could summon or destroy entire civilizations. He understood, with a chilling clarity, why the Emperor had remained silent, why the galaxy had been denied this truth for 10,000 years. And yet, the temptation to speak, to know, to unlock the final mystery, gnawed at him like a demon whispering in the dark. The final vision came unbidden in the moment between consciousness and the void. The scholar saw the Emperor not as the gilded figure enthroned on Terra, but as Neoth, a being striding through the flames of countless wars, shaping humanity's fate with hands both tender and terrible. The fragments converged, a mosaic of memory and identity, revealing glimpses of decisions made to preserve, to destroy, to guide, and to protect. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the vision receded, leaving a single truth burning in his mind. The Emperor's true name was not lost, it was deliberately hidden, a secret kept to save humanity from itself. Yet knowing this, even partially, carried a weight almost unbearable. For in that weight lay the realization that the Imperium, the galaxy, and every soul within it were part of a grand design too vast, too intricate, and too terrifying for any mortal to fully comprehend. As the scholar emerged from the chamber, the storm on the horizon illuminated the ruined world, and the distant stars seemed to shimmer with promise and menace alike. Sergeant Corvan, aboard his strike cruiser, gazed into the void of space stretched endlessly, a black sea dotted with stars whose light was older than most human civilizations. A lone craft, battered and smoking from skirmishes with unseen enemies, drifted silently toward a shattered planet, its hull etched with scorched markings that told of countless battles. Within the bridge, Sergeant Corvan stared at the viewport, his ceramite armor reflecting the distant starlight, the weight of millennia pressing down on him like an invisible shroud. The recent discovery of fragments of Neoth's past haunted him, gnawing at the rigid faith that had guided his life. He had seen too much, known too much, and yet the Emperor's purpose remained inscrutable. The whispers of Neoth and the shadows of identities long erased seemed to pulse through the void itself, as if the cosmos conspired to remind him that history is never truly written, only hidden. On the surface of the dying world, the scholar pressed further into the ruins, guided by glyphs that seemed to shift beneath his gaze. The chamber he entered was circular, its walls carved with symbols that twisted like living script, almost as if they resented human comprehension. The air smelled of ozone and decay, and a low hum resonated through the stone floor, vibrating into his chest and stirring a memory that was not his own. Within the center of the chamber, a pedestal bore a crystalline object, pulsing with a faint, unnatural light. As he reached out, the whispers began not in words, but in visions, fragments of thought, shards of identity that hinted at the Emperor's earliest consciousness. He recoiled, understanding that this was no mere artifact, but a repository of essence, a remnant of the being known as Neoth, whose influence had shaped mankind long before Terra became the cradle of the Imperium. Above the planet, the sky tore open with unnatural fury. Warp storms, fueled by unknown malice, churned like a living tide. Demons emerged, grotesque and gleaming with the light of unholy fire, their forms shifting between animal, insect, and nightmare. Corvan's squad descended in drop pods, bolters roaring and missiles streaking toward the intruders, yet every victory seemed hollow. The demons moved with purpose, intelligent and cruel, as if aware of the scholar below. The air itself seemed to pulse with the memory of past wars, the psychic residue of those who had died to protect the secrets now unearthed. Amidst the violence, Corvan felt a strange resonance, a vibration through his mind as though the Emperor himself was observing, weighing, guiding, yet withholding understanding. The battlefield was no longer mere combat. It was a crucible testing the limits of perception and faith. The scholar, forced to confront the crystalline object, felt a sudden rupture in his consciousness. Images flooded him, memories not his own, lives lived in times before Terra's sun first shone on humanity's scattered colonies. He saw Neoth commanding fleets of humans and aliens alike, orchestrating alliances that would later be denied from history. He witnessed the creation of the Primarchs, each an echo of facets of Neoth's identity, a deliberate scattering of the Emperor's original consciousness across the stars. The revelation was intoxicating and terrifying. Each fragment he absorbed carried the weight of entire civilizations, the agony of sacrifice, and the responsibility of shaping the future. To know this was to understand that the Emperor had not merely hidden his name, but had orchestrated humanity's destiny with cold, relentless precision. In the midst of the warp storm above, the Ultramarines fought with unwavering resolve, yet the demonic tide shifted with uncanny intelligence. Corvan realized that their enemy was not simply a chaotic force, but a reflection of knowledge, a manifestation of the secrets now uncovered by the scholar. The demons twisted into forms that mirrored the Primarchs, the Emperor, even the scholar himself, as if reality itself sought to confront him with his own hubris. Bolters spat fire, chain swords roared, and yet each blow seemed to pass through shadows of truth, striking only illusions. In the screams and flashes of flame, Corvan felt a tremor of doubt. If the Emperor's true identity was ever revealed, if the fragments of Neoth were allowed to coalesce, could the Imperium survive the weight of that knowledge? Or would it shatter under the realization that the savior they worshipped was a being beyond morality, beyond mercy, beyond comprehension? Within the ruined chamber, the scholar attempted to withdraw, but the object pulsed with sudden intensity. He felt the presence of Neoth reach into his mind, probing, testing, and in almost imperceptible way, judging. A vision unfolded. The Emperor not on Terra, not enthroned and eternal, but walking through the fire of humanity's first wars, a figure simultaneously compassionate and terrible, weaving threads of fate that mortals could never perceive. The scholar staggered, torn between awe and terror. He realized that the Emperor's concealment of his name was not merely strategy, it was necessity. The galaxy could not endure the knowledge of the full truth, and yet to deny it was to wrestle with the impossible, to act with faith in a being whose motives and methods were beyond comprehension. Back on the strike cruiser, Corvan's squad intercepted a transmission from the planet's surface. The scholar's voice, distorted and trembling, spoke of discoveries that could change everything, identities that predated the Emperor, technologies lost to time, and fragments of consciousness that suggested the Emperor's divinity was not singular, but a composite of countless selves. The revelation struck Corvan with the force of a psychic hammer. Every battle fought in the Emperor's name, every sacrifice made, every loyalty sworn, all seemed part of a grand experiment, a web spun across millennia. The squad's bolters fired into the approaching demonic host, but even their fire could not pierce the deeper truth now pressing on his mind. The Imperium's foundation was built not solely on faith or heroism, but on a carefully orchestrated concealment, a labyrinth of identity, power, and sacrifice. The demonic forms finally surged toward the planet's heart, their claws tearing through ruins that had survived for eons. Corvan led his squad into the thick of battle, each strike a desperate attempt to shield the scholar below. Yet as the enemy fell, it seemed only to fragment, revealing smaller horrors that multiplied and pressed closer. Amid the din, Corvan glimpsed a truth that froze him. The demons were responding to understanding itself, to the uncovering of hidden identities. Knowledge had become a weapon, and the Emperor's secrets were at the epicenter. Faith, courage, and loyalty were tested not by blade or fire alone, but by the terrifying clarity of truth, which had the power to consume as completely as any demon. Within the chamber, the scholar reached out, finally touching the crystalline repository, and the visions converged. Time fractured. He saw the Emperor as Neoth, as a multitude of cells layered upon one another, each making sacrifices, each choosing which fragments to reveal and which to hide. The full horror and grandeur of the design became apparent. The Imperium itself was not merely a civilization, but a living constructive decisions made to balance survival against knowledge, faith against reality. The object's light flared, and he realized with agonizing clarity that to preserve the Imperium, the Emperor had hidden himself behind layers of identity, leaving only fragments for mortals to grasp. Yet even this act of preservation carried consequences. Those who glimpsed the truth could not remain unchanged. Corvan's squad finally broke through the demonic tide, but the battlefield had been transformed. The ruins were scarred with psychic burns, echoes of the visions the scholar had endured. Corvan felt the presence of the Emperor in a new, unsettling way, not as a god or a figure of authority, but as a mind vast and terrible, whose motives encompassed the rise and fall of civilizations. The revelation settled uneasily on him. The war they had fought, the sacrifices made, were pieces of a cosmic chessboard, and he had only begun to comprehend the scale. He understood that the Emperor's true name, the fragments of Neoth, and the hidden selves interwoven into humanity's destiny were not just secrets, they were the very framework of reality, and the consequences of their exposure could reshape the galaxy itself. As the storm cleared, the scholar and Corvan's squad regrouped, their minds heavy with knowledge and dread. The ruined planet, once silent, now seemed to hum with memory, the whispers of Neoth threading through the air, resonating with truths too vast for comprehension. And in that moment, a realization struck them both. The Emperor's concealment of his name was not merely a shield for the Imperium, but a test, an ongoing trial of humanity's capacity to endure truth. The galaxy's fate was poised on a knife edge, and the next revelation, the next fragment of identity, would either guide humanity toward survival or plunge it into chaos. The vision receded, leaving only questions, shadows, and the eerie certainty that the Emperor's story was far from complete. Somewhere in the fragments of history, the echoes of Neoth waited to be fully understood, and the cost of that understanding promised to be greater than any war yet fought. The universe held its breath, the stars themselves seeming to whisper, "When the next fragment is revealed, the balance will shift, and the very foundation of the Imperium will tremble." The skies over the ruined world had turned a sickly green, as if the planet itself were bleeding into the void. Warp energy coiled and twisted like serpents across the horizon, and the distant stars shimmered with a faint, otherworldly resonance. Sergeant Corvan stood atop a crumbling spire, bolter in hand, watching as the demonic tide ebbed and swelled with an intelligence that defied comprehension. The battlefield was a theater of madness. Flashes of flame revealed silhouettes of Marines locked in combat, with forms that seemed to exist between reality and nightmare. Each clash resonated with echoes of past sacrifices, the weight of 10,000 years pressing upon them like the gravity of a dead sun. The scholar's warnings about Neoth's fragments reverberated in Corvan's mind. The Emperor's concealed identities, the truths hidden across time, had drawn attention. And now the universe itself seemed to shiver in anticipation of revelation. In the shadowed chamber beneath the ruins, the scholar traced the glowing symbols that had pulsed since his arrival. Each glyph throbbed with a rhythm that matched the psychic currents above the planet, as if the very universe were a resonant body and he its trembling nerve. He had seen the visions, felt the fragments of Neoth's consciousness fold into his own, and understood that the Emperor's concealment of his true name was not a simple precaution, but a defensive measure against forces that hungered for knowledge and power. The shards of memory he now held threatened to fracture his mind. He paused, the air thick with ozone and the residue of eons, realizing that even the smallest slip in thought, the slightest temptation to speak what should remain unspoken, could draw the attention of powers far beyond mortal reckoning. Above the planet, the Ultramarines fought desperately to maintain a tenuous foothold. Corvan's squad was reduced to a handful, each Marine bearing wounds that were both physical and psychic. The demonic host pulsed in rhythm with the psychic surge emanating from the scholar's chamber, and Corvan felt the connection in his bones. The battlefield itself was alive, aware, reacting. Every swing of a chainsword, every detonated bolter round, seemed to push back against a tide of revelation and consequence. And in the eye of the storm, a single truth became horrifyingly clear. The Emperor's design was fracturing under the strain of discovery. Forces that had been held in balance for 10 millennia were now tilting, and the cost of unearthing fragments of his past might surpass the toll of any single war. The chamber vibrated violently as the scholar reached the apex of his understanding. The crystalline repository flared with light, casting distorted shadows across the walls etched with Neoth's arcane script. For a moment, the air fell silent. The howling winds and the clash of bolters above seemed to vanish, replaced by a psychic stillness that pressed into the soul. In that silence, he glimpsed the Emperor as Neoth, not a god enthroned on Terra, but a figure navigating countless timelines, each self-sacrificing fragments of identity to maintain the balance of human destiny. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. The Emperor's divinity was a construct of self-erasure and meticulous orchestration, and every revelation now risked undoing millennia of careful design. Suddenly, a shockwave of warp energy surged outward from the chamber, ripping through the atmosphere above. Corvan's squad was thrown back, ceramite armor groaning under the psychic strain. Demons reeled, shrieking as if in pain, their forms distorting and fracturing in response to the upheaval. The scholar stumbled, barely able to maintain control of his own mind, as visions of Neoth overlapped with the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the endless wars of the Great Crusade. Each image carried with it the agony of sacrifice and the burden of foresight, and he understood that the fragments of Neoth were now resonating across the galaxy, their awakening rippling through reality like cracks in a cathedral's foundation. The warp itself seemed to respond, forming a vortex above the planet that stretched toward the heavens. Stars bent and shimmered, and the psychic storm thickened, a tangible pressure that pressed on both mind and body. Corvan, his vision narrowed and heart pounding, realized that the demonic host was converging toward the vortex, drawn to the energy emanating from the scholar's discovery. The battlefield had become a nexus of fate, a point where the consequences of past decisions and hidden identities collided with the raw, destructive hunger of chaos. Each bolter round fired, each strike of the chainsword, was an act of defiance against an inevitability that seemed written in the stars themselves. In the midst of the chaos, the scholar perceived a new pattern. The fragments of Neoth were aligning, not randomly, but deliberately. It was as if the Emperor's hidden selves were coalescing, drawn by an invisible logic that spanned centuries and star systems. The implications were staggering. Should the fragments converge fully, the Emperor's true consciousness might reassert itself, bringing clarity or catastrophe to the galaxy. The scholar understood that he now held a key to events far beyond his comprehension. The repository was not merely a record. It was a trigger, a mechanism through which the Emperor's concealed identity could influence reality once more. Yet even as he grasped the truth, dread filled his heart. Some forces in the warp had noticed, and their response would not wait. High above, Corvan's squad engaged a demon lord, its form shifting through impossible geometries, eyes burning with alien intelligence. Every attack seemed to slow, as though time itself resisted their efforts. He felt the psychic pressure of the scholar's chamber, the resonance of Neoth's fragments twisting and pulling at the edges of perception. The demonic entity screamed in recognition of the awakening knowledge, a sound that was part rage, part despair, part the echo of a universe remembering truths better left forgotten. Corvan's heart hammered in his chest. He realized that their fight was no longer physical, it was existential. The outcome would not merely decide life or death, but the integrity of the Imperium, the very stability of human civilization. In the chamber, the scholar's mind teetered on the brink. Memories of Neoth, the Emperor, and the Primarchs converged in a storm of clarity and horror. He glimpsed timelines where humanity fell, where the Imperium crumbled under the weight of revelation. The psychic feedback nearly crushed him, yet amid the chaos, a single, undeniable truth crystallized. The Emperor's concealment of his name and identity was not merely a precaution, but the linchpin holding the galaxy together. Any misstep could fracture reality itself, opening the path for chaos to consume all. His hands trembled over the crystalline repository, knowing that his next action would ripple across the stars. Below, the demonic host began to regroup, drawn inexorably toward the scholar's chamber. Corvin and his remaining squad members held the line with grim determination, bolters and flamers blazing. The screams of fallen brothers echoed through the void, and in their faces, one could see the same realization dawning. This was not a battle of skill or courage alone, but of comprehension and endurance. The Emperor's secrets had awakened forces that even centuries of faith and loyalty could scarcely contain. Each moment of delay, each hesitation, carried a weight that pressed upon their souls with unbearable gravity. And then, in a final harrowing moment before the storm reached its peak, the scholar perceived a subtle shift. The fragments of Neoth, the echoes of the Emperor's original consciousness, began to pulse in unison, resonating with a frequency that threatened to tear apart both mind and matter. The chamber's walls glowed, casting shadows that danced like specters of heroes and martyrs long dead. The universe seemed to pause, holding its breath as if aware that the next instant would decide the fate of everything. The psychic storm above the planet intensified. The demons paused mid-attack, and even Corvin felt the pull of something vast, incomprehensible, and terrifyingly close. The air itself hummed with anticipation, a chorus of dread and awe echoing across the stars. In that pregnant silence, the scholar and Corvin understood the truth. The Emperor's name, the fragments of Neoth, the concealed identities, and the cosmic strategies woven across millennia were converging. The galaxy stood on the precipice of revelation, and no soul could predict the consequences. Somewhere beyond comprehension, the threads of fate coiled tighter, ready to unleash the culmination of a plan 10,000 years in the making. And as the stars trembled and the air cracked with psychic energy, one thought lingered above all others. The moment of truth was at hand, and when it came, nothing would remain unchanged. The Eye of Terror itself seemed to lean closer, watching, waiting, as the final act of concealment prepared to collapse. The chamber erupted. Light flared from the crystalline repository, spilling across the ancient glyphs that had waited in silence for millennia. The scholar screamed not from pain, but from comprehension. The fragments of Neoth coalesced in his mind, weaving together into a consciousness both alien and intimately human. The Emperor, in his true essence, was revealed. A cascade of memories poured forth. Battles fought across the stars before humanity had even named itself. Alliances forged and broken with alien races. The creation of the Primarchs as vessels of power and foresight. The truth struck like a hammer. He had been many, and yet one. A being who sacrificed parts of himself to preserve the whole. The realization was a weight beyond bearing. Tears ran down the scholar's face as he understood the magnitude. The galaxy had worshipped a mask, revered a construct, and yet it had survived because of it. Above, the psychic storm boiled. The demonic host shrieked, their forms twisting and writhing as if reality itself rejected their existence. Corvan's squad fought desperately to keep the creatures at bay, bolter fire tearing through flesh and shadow alike. Every impact resonated with the energy emanating from the scholar below, each kill echoing in the warp as the Emperor's fragments stirred. Corvan felt it in his bones. The being they had served for 10 millennia was awakening in full, and the battlefield was a conduit. His chainsword roared, cleaving a demon that flickered between shapes, and for a moment he glimpsed the impossible. The Emperor, not distant and golden on his throne, but here, in the essence of everything, shaping reality itself. The chamber vibrated violently. Walls cracked, stones levitated, and the very air thrummed with psychic resonance. The scholar could no longer differentiate his thoughts from those of Neoth, from those of the Emperor himself. He understood the purpose behind the concealment of the true name. It was a shield, a safeguard, and a prison. Knowledge of it alone could unravel the delicate balance that preserved human civilization. And yet, now that the fragments had touched him, he could see the calculus behind 10,000 years of war, the deliberate choices that shaped the Imperium, the lives sacrificed to keep chaos at bay. He could feel the suffering of every world, every soldier, every soul whose life had been a thread in the Emperor's grand design. Suddenly, a rift tore open above the planet, a jagged wound in reality that revealed the Eye of Terror in all its nightmarish glory. Energy poured from it, searing the sky and rippling the fabric of the material universe. Demons surged through the opening, but this time, they did not charge mindlessly. They hesitated, recoiling before the manifestation of power emanating from the chamber below. Corvan saw it, felt it, and knew the truth. The Emperor's full presence, the awakening of his original consciousness, radiated like a tide, and nothing within the warp could touch it without consequence. Every warrior on the battlefield felt their courage and faith tested against an impossible standard. Some faltered. Others rose with a clarity that only the immediacy of death can bring. The scholar's vision expanded. He saw Neoth's earliest decisions, the calculation and heartbreak that had forged the Emperor. Worlds were saved and destroyed according to principles mortals could barely comprehend. Primarchs, once thought to be instruments of war alone, were revealed as reflections of choice, morality, and potential sacrifice in a cosmic experiment. The scholar's mind burned with the knowledge the Emperor had not been perfect. He had been relentless, sometimes cruel, and yet always necessary. The beauty and terror of it struck him. The galaxy existed because of acts that would be considered sins by any human standard. And in the realization came grief, because no hero, no martyr, no soldier could ever truly grasp the scope of such responsibility. Below, Corvan faced a demon lord larger than any cathedral, its limbs fracturing reality, its eyes twin voids of malice. His squad, exhausted and diminished, fought with every shred of courage remaining. Bolter fire and melta beams scorched the creature, but it adapted instantly, each deathless motion a response to their understanding of the battlefield, their knowledge of the Emperor's secrets. In that instant, Corvan glimpsed a horrifying possibility. The demons were learning, evolving in resonance with the fragments of Neoth that pulsed from the chamber. Every action, every revelation of the past fed them. He realized that the Emperor's concealment had been as much a prison for his enemies as a shield for humanity. To see the truth was to invite peril, but to remain ignorant risked oblivion. The chamber's light flared higher, engulfing the scholar completely. He felt himself stretched across time and space, tethered to every act of the Emperor. He saw battles in the void, entire fleets shattered by decisions he now understood were preordained. He heard the screams of those who had died to preserve the Imperium, and among them, a strange serenity emerged, a knowledge that every sacrifice, every moment of suffering, had been a choice for survival, a covenant with fate itself. Yet the weight was unbearable. The truth pressed on his mind like gravity, crushing and clarifying in equal measure. He understood that the Emperor's identity was not merely hidden. It had been entrusted to history, tested in fire and blood, waiting for a moment when revelation could serve both judgment and salvation. Corvan's squad pressed forward, bolters roaring, chainswords tearing. The demon lord shrieked as psychic energy lanced through the battlefield, struck by forces unseen yet undeniable. The vortex in the sky above widened, but the demons faltered, their movements uncoordinated as if uncertain before an intellect beyond comprehension. Corvan felt a new emotion, not fear, not awe, but profound responsibility. He understood that their fight, every drop of blood spilled, every world defended, was part of a grand tapestry. The Emperor's presence was no longer distant. It was immediate, overwhelming, yet merciful in a way that mortals could barely touch. Every strike they delivered carried weight. Every victory exacted a price. And yet the chance to survive this night now rested on understanding the pattern, not just brute force. The scholar, suspended in the convergence of consciousness, realized the final horror and beauty of Neoth. The Emperor's true name, his essence, was not a weapon. It was a lens through which the universe itself was balanced. To speak it aloud would unravel worlds. To act with understanding could preserve them. He trembled, knowing that his next thought, his next movement, might determine whether the Imperium endured or perished. Time and space seemed to pause, the chamber a crucible where fate, consciousness, and history collided. In the silence, he glimpsed the Emperor as both god and man, as both savior and tyrant, and he understood that the galaxy's survival was tied to the endurance of faith, intellect, and sacrifice combined. The demonic host began to collapse under the psychic resonance. Corvan's squad fought with renewed clarity, inspired by the presence they could not name, but felt with every fiber of their being. The planet trembled as energy from the chamber radiated outward, tearing rifts in the sky and stitching them anew in a pattern only visible to those attuned to the Emperor's design. Every Marine who had survived felt the gravity of the revelation. They were not pawns, but participants in a plan spanning millennia, their actions echoing in ways they could not yet comprehend. The battlefield, though scarred and smoldering, became a stage for the final proof that humanity could endure, that the Emperor's vision, however masked, had guided them to this moment. The scholar's consciousness began to withdraw, the fragments of Neoth receding, leaving him breathless and changed. He carried within him the memory of the Emperor in full, a truth so vast it defied speech. Tears streaked his face as the weight of knowledge settled upon his shoulders. He had glimpsed eternity, sacrifice, and divinity, and understood the price paid by mortals and immortals alike. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the distant rumble of collapsing ruins above. Outside, the stars returned to their cold, indifferent glow, yet the echoes of the psychic storm lingered, a reminder that the Emperor's presence, hidden and revealed, would always watch, always guide, and always demand. Above, Corvan looked out over the battlefield. The demonic remnants dissipated into the warp, the rift closing slowly as if the eye of terror itself acknowledged the resolution of this night. The survivors, though battered and broken, stood tall, bearing the knowledge that their fight had been part of something larger, something eternal. Yet even in the quiet, a tremor of dread lingered. The Emperor's true identity had been glimpsed, and with it came the knowledge that the galaxy's survival was precarious, contingent, and fragile. The moment of revelation had passed, but the consequences would echo for millennia. The storm had abated, but the silence that followed was heavy with remembrance, sacrifice, and the unspoken question. What next, when the Emperor's hidden The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and ash, the remnants of the psychic storm settling into a quiet hum that seemed almost alive. The battlefield lay silent now, scorched and shattered, yet oddly ordered, as if the Emperor's influence had left a final signature upon the ruins. Sergeant Corvin knelt beside the charred remains of what had once been a demon lord, the silence pressing on him harder than any war cry. Around him, the few surviving Marines tended to one another, their armor scorched but unbroken, their eyes reflecting both relief and the unnameable weight of revelation. The scholar emerged from the chamber, staggering but upright, his robes tattered and marked by the glow of Neelth's fragments. In his gaze was the quiet knowledge of something eternal, a truth that had reshaped his understanding of faith, duty, and sacrifice. Together, they stood in a world that had survived its own undoing, yet would never be the same. The ruins beneath their feet were vast, monuments to civilizations that had flourished and failed long before the Imperium's records began. Pillars cracked and half-buried in rubble bore glyphs that still pulsed faintly with latent energy, a reminder of knowledge older than humanity itself. The scholar traced one with his fingers, feeling the vibration of countless lives and choices encoded into the stone. Each carving told of ambition, of sacrifice, of the delicate balance that the Emperor had maintained for 10,000 years. Corvin understood, silently, that every action they had taken, every bolt fired and life given, was part of a chain of consequences stretching across the galaxy. The Emperor's concealment of his true name, his careful orchestration of history, had not been cruelty, it had been necessity. But necessity, Corvin realized, could be as terrible as the most vicious enemy. The scholar paused before the crystalline repository, now dim and inert, yet still humming faintly with the echoes of Neelth's presence. He placed his hands atop it, feeling the residual connection to a consciousness both infinite and painfully intimate. Memories lingered in his mind, Neelth walking among humanity, shaping its destiny through decisions no one could understand, sacrificing pieces of himself so that the whole might endure. And yet, for all the triumph, there was loss. Every Primarch, every legion, every world had borne a cost, and the scholar felt the sorrow and weight of those uncounted lives as if they were his own. He understood at last why the Emperor had hidden his true identity. Some truths are too heavy for mortals to carry, yet the act of concealment itself was a testament to hope, however fragile. Corvin rose slowly, scanning the horizon as the winds of the planet whispered through the ruins. The demonic threat had vanished, pulled back into the folds of the warp by forces that remained unseen, leaving only echoes and memory. He reflected on the battle, on the choices made, and on the revelation of Neelth's fragments. Faith, he realized, was not merely belief, it was endurance in the face of incomprehensible truth. And survival came not through understanding alone, but through action taken despite it. He looked at the scholar, whose face was pale but steady, and saw the quiet burden of knowledge mirrored in his eyes. Together, they represented the duality of the Imperium, the guardians who act, and the witnesses who remember. The sky above, once a violent green maelstrom, had calmed into a muted melancholy twilight. Stars shimmered faintly through lingering warp clouds, distant and indifferent. Corvin allowed himself a long moment of stillness, listening to the silence. Here, amid the ruined spires and blackened stone, he realized the scale of what they had survived. Not just the demons, not just the psychic storm, but the weight of 10 millennia of secrets and sacrifices converging in a single moment. The galaxy, he understood, was fragile. Its history, its heroes, and even its gods existed only because someone had borne the unthinkable. And yet, Even amid triumph, a shadow lingered, a reminder that understanding and survival were not absolutes, and that the future would demand the same terrible choices again and again. The scholar turned away from the repository, the pulsing light fading entirely, leaving the chamber dim but alive with resonance. He walked through the ruins, each step stirring the ghosts of civilizations long vanished. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect, not on what had been revealed, but on the cost of revelation. Knowledge had been gained, yet it came with a shadow. The awareness that the galaxy's survival had always depended on concealment, deception, and the courage to act without understanding. The Emperor's true name remained hidden, yet its echo lingered in the decisions and sacrifices of all who served him. It was a lesson written in suffering, in triumph, and in the quiet, unacknowledged moments between. Above them, Corvan's squad gathered, their armor battered and scorched, yet their spirits tempered by survival. They looked across the wasteland, seeing both ruin and the faint glimmers of hope in the horizon. The psychic storm had passed, leaving clarity where confusion had reigned, yet the weight of knowledge remained. The Imperium would continue, as it always did, built on faith, sacrifice, and the vigilance of those who endured. Corvan realized that heroism was not the absence of fear, nor the certainty of victory, but the act of standing when everything seemed lost. In that quiet moment, the lesson was clear. The galaxy's guardians were defined not by understanding alone, but by the will to act in its preservation, even in the face of truths they could scarcely bear. The scholar finally emerged from the chamber into the dying light, eyes reflecting both the terror and the beauty of what he had witnessed. He stopped to look back at the repository, now silent, and whispered to himself a name he knew he must never speak aloud. It was the weight of Neoth, the Emperor, and all the fragments of identity intertwined, a name that carried the memory of wars, sacrifices, and choices too vast for human comprehension. Yet even as the whisper died on his lips, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The galaxy had survived, the Emperor's vision endured, and humanity, fragile, flawed, relentless, still walked the stars. Corvan approached, placing a hand on the scholar's shoulder, a gesture of silent understanding. Together, they stood amid the ruins, the wind carrying faint echoes of battle and memory. The world, though scarred, seemed to breathe again, a fragile testament to endurance. Above, the stars began to pierce the twilight, indifferent yet steadfast. And in the quiet, one could almost feel the presence of the Emperor watching, neither judging nor guiding, but simply observing, allowing the galaxy to bear the consequences of its own choices, while quietly shaping the currents of fate for those brave enough to act. As they turn to leave, the camera of imagination pulls back, revealing the shattered spires, the blackened plains, and the distant horizon where warp storms once raged. The scholar and Corvan are tiny against the scale of a universe that had been both tested and preserved. Silence reigns, but it is a loaded silence, the kind that lingers in the chest and mind long after the battle has ended. Questions hang, unspoken yet heavy. How much must be hidden to protect life? How many sacrifices are justified to preserve a fragile hope? And when the true nature of the Emperor is finally glimpsed, will humanity endure, or has it already been defined by the shadows of the truths it cannot bear? The wind stirs across the ruins, carrying ash and memory. Somewhere in the distant void, stars flicker and pulse with quiet intensity, marking the persistence of life, struggle, and sacrifice. The galaxy, battered yet unbroken, waits. The legacy of Neoth, of the Emperor, and of all who had acted in the shadows and light remains hidden in plain sight, inscribed in decisions and sacrifices that no history could fully record. And as the camera pulls further back, leaving the figures alone amidst the hushed battlefield, one thing is certain: the story is over for this moment, but the echoes will endure. The Imperium lives on, fragile, defiant, and eternal.